Working with survivors of severe trauma involves hearing and being with stories of intense fear, shock, and horror. A client's trauma experience might be conveyed in words, but it also becomes present in sessions in ways without words. And the task of both working with these images in the service of the client's recovery and protecting ourselves from psychological injury is a complex one that involves several processes. Two of the fundamentals are boundaries and self-care, the themes of our clinical evening. I use myself in this work. Who I am encompasses how I understand and communicate. I put energy into reflecting on my work and how it impacts on me. I identify what it engages in me, and this is because I believe that I'll have responses to clients and their material that is useful to the therapy and also to my own growth. In this, I've been gobsmacked, overjoyed, relieved, burnt out, disillusioned, but I never thought of myself as being traumatized by this work. However, I had a profound experience that I'd like to share with you to illustrate that these impacts can be subtle and their resolution challenging. So I'm going to talk about the issues of boundaries, vicarious traumatization, and self-care. I won't go into the discussion about whether vicarious traumatization is a counter-transference reaction or not. I'll go with George's position on that. And I'd like to explain how I view and work with them. To hopefully illustrate, I'm going to present a small section of work with the client, referring specifically to the work we did together to reduce intrusive symptoms that were deeply distressing for her. A boundary is the point at which we meet. It's also the point at which we define our separateness. What is me and what is you? It's also the edge that holds, the container. In therapy, it represents a containment field, and one that I as therapists maintain both physically and mentally in three spheres: externally, relationally, and internally. And setting up the external and relational boundaries involves some behaviors or rules that are usually openly articulated. The usual list includes some absolutes and some context dependent. For example, contact in sessions, touching people or not touching them, the kind of social contact we can have with clients, the sessions themselves, where we have them, how long they're for, gifts, self-disclosure, confidentiality. These things are to provide safety, to provide a safe space for a client. And they don't sound so complex. They're there to provide a frame for the work, to create a holding environment. But our minds are also the holding environments, and this is where the more subtle boundaries are created. I need to keep my mind available for therapy, using a kind of internal boundary to sort of partition off my stuff. However, I need to access my stuff all the time because it makes me who I am, authentic. It provides information about things, about me and about the client. And my mind needs to connect deeply with the clients. I have to take in the client's reality and strive to understand it. My empathy, according to heaps of research, is one of my greatest tools. Empathic attunement with a client and their distress involves being with and being separate. As communication from the client enters my awareness, it resonates or connects with what I already know from my experience. And this experience might be in my awareness, so like really accessible memory, piece of knowledge, but it might be outside of conscious awareness. And the resonance occurs at a non-conscious level. So I might be left with a felt sense of something. And this is happening at a private level, inside me, part of me. I've got to be empathically open to it, and I am necessarily changed by it. McCann and Coletti also talk about understanding as a dance, that I approach what I want to understand with an open attitude. I need to move with the client toward the dangerous material of memory, and then away when it's too threatening. I must be sure that my movements towards and away are done in the service of the client. And that requires exquisite clinical judgment and a fine attunement to many layers, most significantly to my countertransference. Following McCann, Perlman, and so on writing in the 90s, many authors now talk about countertransference in more universal terms. So not just reflecting a resonance between a therapist and the client's material. And this conceptualization paved the way for the now widely accepted notion that we as therapists can be traumatized in the course of doing trauma work, so that the images and the details presented by a client become traumatic for us when we're exposed to them. And so vicarious traumatization became a way of thinking about therapist responses, not replacing the conventional notions, but acknowledging the power of trauma. And their research showed from early on that the greatest risk for developing VT is having experienced trauma ourselves. So it doesn't make it our fault, but it does mean that if we've experienced personal trauma, we should be much more careful with ourselves, more aware of when things affect us, more ready to act by seeking support. We always walk the tightrope between intense empathic connection and kind of emotional separation. And we're all familiar with previous talks about countertransference and the rescue triangle and so on, with the enmeshment, disengagement continuum. I think it was one of Carpen's things. So if the boundary is too solid, it might prevent me coming close enough to the client, close enough to their inner experience. But if the boundary between the therapist and the patient becomes too permeable and the countertransference reactions are not monitored, vicarious traumatization may result, and the therapist may experience intrusive thoughts, trauma-related imagery, and re-experiencing phenomena. The primary experience of VT is internal, and the impacts aren't always negative, but it's a transformation of our inner experience affecting a range of areas: our sense of meaning and worldview, our identity, our interpersonal relationships, and our sensory memory. As McCann and Coletti say, they speak of us as therapists experiencing specific trauma-embedded images and recollections that have been conveyed by the traumatized patient. So, to protect ourselves, to prevent VT, and ensure we are optimally available to our clients, we attend supervision and we engage in self-care. To plan self-care, and it needs planning apparently, we do an audit, we work out what's on, our trauma load, what's been working for us. Usually we have to adjust our time, our management of our time, and we might plan changes in our personal, professional, and organizational realms. And this usually involves new behaviors. So this is what a personal self-care plan might look like. And most of the standard activities in that facilitate some nervous system regulation at some level. And they do indeed include treating ourselves, maybe a massage here, a hot bath, a chocolate treat. But good self-care is not a hot bath and chocolate. It's a commitment to ourselves that addresses as directly as possible the issues and dynamics that create discomfort and imbalance. Not everything that makes us feel good is self-care. And not everything that is good self-care feels good. Self-care is hard. Caring for the self, as opposed to the other, for which we train hard and get paid, is often only done in response to burnout or some other impact of the way that we care. And too few therapists are trained in a tradition that required us to be in our own therapy as part of our training. So when the time comes to practice self-care, we turn to the self-care plan rather than to the care of the self. And laid out like a list of New Year's resolutions, the self-care plan of the trauma therapist is doomed to fail, unless it takes into account the ways that coming near trauma changes us, the way it brings us closer to the vulnerabilities at the core of every human around trust, safety, integrity, shame, and horror. I believe that the only way self-care happens is relationally, in supervision or in therapy. A few words about supervision, clinical supervision. In the way it's set up, we need to feel held and have the containment that we offer clients modeled in that relationship. It's a space for reflection and for support so that we can sustain empathy. So we spend time reflecting on how we think about the work and how we are in the work. We aim, I guess, I hope, to change those things that inhibit us, accurately thinking about and engaging with the client. And some of those things that inhibit in that way are very confronting to think about. And they might include feelings aroused, from the more obvious and acceptable like horror, to the forbidden, like sadistic impulses or thrill. These feelings can interrupt a connection and can damage rapport severely, particularly when we focus on and try to defend against our own feelings. Supervision is also a space to establish the boundary between myself and the client's self, where we identify where our private demons and fears have awoken or been evoked. In my work with the clients I'm going to present soon, this was a clear point with hindsight, and the thinking that too readily normalizes responses nearly prevented me reflecting very deeply in therapy about my own response. So the client's given me permission to talk about our work together. I've gone to some lengths to disguise her identity. So I'm presenting her as Branka, age 63, from the former Yugoslavia. She was referred in 2010, just over a year after her arrival, for ongoing dysphoria reported to her GP who was concerned about depression. This slide is a slight adaptation of Start's model for formulating a client's experience and presentation, and I'm just going to use it as a way of conveying the basic information about the client and those events and dynamics that kind of contribute to her current presentation and inform the work we do together. So a significant history from a war, migration and resettlement point of view. Branka was a Serb woman married to a man of Bosnian ethnicity. Their marriage was a good one, although he could be violent, but never towards her. She thought of him as a little wolf cub who needed to be mothered. They were engaged members of their local community and had close relationships with neighbours, most of whom were Serb. Poverty following World War II had meant that both had been forced to work around the home in subsistence labour. However, their children had both gone to school, followed by study at a technical college nearby, and both later studied engineering. War started in her area in 1995. There was no open fighting, but they noted the increasing presence of Serb soldiers with their accompanying sense of danger and mistrust. There was tension with some neighbours, and they knew that they would be targeted as a mixed marriage, but they felt too old to move. They encouraged their children to go to Germany, though, in 1996, as soon as that avenue became possible. Branka was 50 when her husband of over 30 years was killed, presumably by someone they knew. Her children both married and were granted refugee status in Australia, applying from Germany, and were both fairly well settled when Branka arrived in Sydney in 2008. Her practical settlement was uneventful, and she felt welcomed into the broader former Yugoslav community. As a woman in her 60s, Branka is unlikely to be employed, and due to normal age-related cognitive changes, might find it harder to learn English. She lives with her daughter and her family. Her daily life was that of an involved grandmother, speaking Serbian to her grandchildren and helping with daily tasks. During assessment, in addition to the initial clinical interview, Branka completed several psychometric measures that we use with all clients at starts. Hopkins and the DAS both showed she had significant features of anxiety and depression, particularly poor sleep, recurrent troubling thoughts, spells of anxiety, and little motivation. There were a few issues with her completing the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, but the second time I did it, she was speaking of having intrusive phenomena and strong reactions to these. However, her experience of her symptoms was a more useful thing for guiding our work together, and her experience made it clear that grief was the most prominent and distressing symptom. She was thinking daily of her husband, unable to give any detail, but just feeling intense sadness and feeling forsaken. Her goals: I only want to not feel depressed and sad. She was aware of needing to move on, as I think quite a few people in her community were telling her she needed to do. I actually don't think she wanted to move on from his death. So there are a few hypotheses that we would all naturally generate. From her description of her most troubling symptoms, it was clear that she was experiencing complicated grief. She longed for her husband daily, and she felt she had little to look forward to without him. She couldn't create a new life or a new future without him. She sometimes spoke as if confused about his death, as though she hadn't accepted its truth. She had no photos in the house, couldn't generate images of him to reflect on. So the treatment plan is driven by our hypotheses and the client's goals. And all of these hypotheses that I made up for myself could have been true. But mostly the aim would be to build a fuller picture of the person that she'd lost, to do grief work. Our therapy involved about 18 sessions, and the work was fundamentally supportive. And the nature of that support meant that later, when it was needed, exposure work was possible. I use the word exposure slightly advisedly, though. The transference, the relationship between the two of us, was positive, didn't appear complicated. Branka told me some lovely stories about her husband, but she couldn't visualize him, which I did ask her to do, in relation to simple things like making coffee. After about 8 sessions focusing on their relationship and on the grief, she was a lot less depressed, but a lot more afraid and edgy. When I noted this, she said she was anticipating something horrible. She had a sense of foreboding, something horrible around the corner, she said. And a feeling of dread pervaded our sessions too. We couldn't go forward with that level of dread, really. So I recall asking her to visualize a corner with the aim of having her take charge of the forward motion, at least in terms of her internal state. I just wanted her to approach the corner, not particularly look around it. But the image was there, waiting around the corner, and she described to me the day she found her murdered husband. I felt enormous sadness at the way she described it, the details she mentioned and those she didn't mention. It had been a misty morning and he'd gone to the garden for a cigarette. When he didn't return, she thought he'd gone straight to the neighbours for a coffee. She wasn't worried. She decided then to go to the neighbours a bit later with some food to share lunch. On her way back home, he wasn't there either, and she still wasn't worried. On her way home, she went into the backyard to check if he was there. She couldn't see him anywhere. The mist was still heavy. She went to the well, which was a dry well, to line up the cabbages that she'd picked at the neighbours. And as she walked around the well, she saw her husband's hand and arm. And she froze in the narrative, just as she'd frozen then. And I asked if she'd felt back in the moment, and she did. I asked her to stay there gently and quietly, and then to walk forwards when she felt ready. She really struggled with this. We returned to it in the next session, slowly walking towards him. When it remained difficult, I decided to change my position, with the intention of helping to recreate an internal scene, this time with the sense of being accompanied. I asked her to have me there in the image, and once she could feel me there, to indicate that. I was aware of holding my breath. She barely breathed. I made a conscious effort to breathe and instructed her to breathe in and to look around within the image for me. I reinforced that it was safe within the image, which was a combination of what she actually saw and her response to it. That night, I saw her husband's hand. I felt terribly sad. It seemed incredibly lonely and disembodied. And at various times over the following week, the image would drift across my mind's eyes, misty and unclear. I don't feel particularly distressed. I feel a little bit nauseous. I'm just very aware of having this intrusive image. I obviously decided not to share with her the whole of my experience. It was my response to her material, and I needed to manage it. However, it was a shared experience, and this is what she noted. Because I was alone that day, I never believed it. But now you also saw that he is dead. You saw how they killed him. And this put me in mind of van der Kolk's early thinking about attachment and recovery. Referring to something that van der Kolk was writing in about 87, Roth and Batson say, people are able to survive trauma or re-experiencing of traumatic memories when they are bonded to another in some way, even when their help is symbolic. Reflecting deeply on my response and supervision led me to sharing with her some of the sadness that was evoked by the image, and she cried heavily when I did this, suddenly in touch with how lonely his body had been. We continued to work on her image of her husband as the body she saw and as the man she had married, giving both a more whole picture. She reported a reduction in intrusions over the next week and an improvement in energy levels. And over the next few weeks, she continued to feel more herself. Most wonderfully, she said, she could talk about her husband from internal mental images that were clean, she called clean. We worked together for a few more months and decided to end our work together, and I realized it would be me who'd be carrying on the work. I had a great self-care plan at the time, I always do, and the treats and the new habits that I record on the plan made me feel a little better. And that normalizing, that's VT, with the ensuing sort of psychoeducation, didn't really hit the spot. In supervision, rather than normalize my VT, supervision became a space to demarcate, to identify what was mine to manage. And a colleague who I'd paired up with in our EMDR training helped me remove the intrusion. One session of EMDR, one session. But I still needed to work out why I was vulnerable to that image and to explore the sadness it evoked in me. I needed my own therapy for that. I also engaged in a creative writing process that led me to spending time at the beach, reflecting on the remains of people washed up on the shore in Thailand after the tsunami and how their bones carry sadness for me. These processes took me to a very important place, one that I'd needed to revisit, but I'd neglected to. It wasn't a huge trauma, but just a very human pain. Countertransference reactions are regarded in both trauma and psychodynamic models as useful sources of information, most obviously about myself. What is it in me that's being moved in this way? But how did it come to be? I didn't transgress any of those concrete boundaries between myself and Blanca. But the boundaries between self and other are much more complex. I keep the boundaries inside my psyche in the way I let myself think about clients. I have a choice about the journeys my thoughts take, and something had happened to remove that choice. So did I cross the boundary when I asked Branka to take me to the scene of her greatest pain and horror? I'm still not sure if I did. I just felt it was useful to see it as a sort of symbolically being brought into her experience. I did heal with far greater awareness of my own vulnerabilities and a more fine-tuned sense of my own responses. I know the feeling of that space where I need to really pay particular attention to a shift, an internal shift, while I'm with a client. I do wonder, though, has my self been changed by this work? Now, short of the parallel existence of a Deb who practices horticulture or architecture or something, I can't actually know the answer to that. I can only reflect on the impacts that I'm aware of. And in this case, I needed to be aware of a very specific personal pain of my own. So what do I think of self-care? I think it goes beyond the "you're worth it" cliches, towards a deep acknowledgement that it is we ourselves that is engaged when we work with others and their damaged souls. Ourselves have also seen pain and trauma that's not related to that of our clients. We have our own private demons and tears that are part of us. We need to have at least attempted to take care of them, or else they'll revisit us, causing pain, fear, and demoralization, and preventing us really connecting to clients in ways that truly enable change. So here are some readings. Please take a photograph of this and read them. Thank you very much.